This is the third and final installment of the Indigenous Research Network 2022 Research Methods Workshops. You can access the other two on our YouTube channel, which Joshua put up in the chat. And so, you know, we're both building off what we did in the first two workshops, which was data collection and analysis. And now we're moving into knowledge translation. And if you haven't seen those, that's okay. You can, this will all still make sense. So just to acknowledge my position. So I'm from the Yellowknife Dene First Nation. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto in public health. I'm a psychologist. And I live and work here in the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territories where I've raised my family for the last 15 years. And I'm very grateful to be here. And it's very important to me to express that gratitude, not just verbally, but also in my actions. So miigwech. So just a little brief overview. We're going to talk about what Indigenous knowledge translation is, what it means to be based in Indigenous knowledges, what some of the main issues are in Indigenous KT, knowledge translation, some of the steps of doing knowledge translation in Indigenous communities, circle back to, you know, the ethical dimensions of this type of work, have some discussions throughout, and then bring it back to making it really relevant to what each and every person who's at this workshop is doing. And then we'll invite Clay to close. So just sort of getting started, you know, what is Indigenous knowledge translation? People ask me this question all the time. And, you know, we know that knowledge translation, I'm going to say KT for short, even though I don't like acronyms, because it excludes a lot of people from understanding what's going on. But I think we're all on the same page here of knowing that KT is knowledge translation. That's an important part to all research that's done. And there are actually many different ways of understanding what knowledge translation is. So one of the main funding bodies for research in Canada is CIHR, the government health research funding body. And they describe KT as a dynamic and iterative process that's about, you know, sharing, dissemination, synthesis, exchange, and ethically sound application of knowledge to improve the health of Canadians, providing more effective health services and products, and to strengthen the healthcare system. So they have a really, what I would call a Western-based institutional understanding of Indigenous knowledges. Indigenous researchers have begun to make sense of what knowledge translation means from an Indigenous knowledges perspective. So Smiley and colleagues have written that Indigenous KT is about sharing what you know about living a good life. Understanding Indigenous knowledge translation requires us to understand what Indigenous knowledges are as both a conceptual idea, as well as what it means to actually use Indigenous knowledges and practice research in Indigenous knowledges ways. So this means both using an Indigenous knowledges framework and an Indigenous knowledge methodology. You know, so the framework is the conceptual framework. The methodology is what you're actually doing in practice, procedure-wise in the research. So there are many Indigenous methodologies that exist, and we've talked about those in other workshops, which you can find. And I'm just gonna, you know, name a few of them for people to refresh your memory. There's the cultural specific values and principles. So for instance, here in Anishinaabe territory, when I work with the Anishinaabe peoples, you know, we often use the 7 grandfather teachings, and we work from that framework based on what our community partners who may be Anishinaabe are using. We have Haudenosaunee laws that we use when we're working with the Haudenosaunee people, if that's what they want to use. More academic Indigenous methodologies are things like Albert Marshall's two-eyed seeing or Eduardo Duran's hybrid approach, Verna Kirkness's 3 R's, Sean Wilson's research as ceremony, and of course the seminal work in Indigenous methodologies, Linda Tway Smith's decolonizing methodologies. And there are more that are emerging as Indigenous voices become more prominent in the academic literature. So a major challenge in research overall is that the body of Western research and the institutions of universities, hospitals, education systems don't actually always value Indigenous knowledges nor see them as valid in research contexts. So it's just important to note that this concept and term, even Indigenous knowledges, actually grew out of academic and health research. And actually the earliest citation I could find about Indigenous knowledges was in health sciences, in traditional ecological knowledge. That was the first place I saw it written about in the academic world. And these academic definitions and understandings and practices of academic knowledge in a Western context are actually really different than how Indigenous worldviews are actually understood and practiced in community in terms of cultural, spiritual, political, and social ways of knowing and being. Because in community, this way of thinking from an Indigenous epistemology is always intimately connected to an action that goes along with it. And I think that's one way to understand the difference of what Indigenous knowledges means in an academic or Western setting and what it actually means in community settings. So that's important to understand when we're talking about Indigenous knowledges and research. So Indigenous knowledges doesn't actually have one definition. It's more of an understanding, and UNESCO does a great job of sort of encapsulating this understanding as Indigenous knowledges being about local and Indigenous skills, understandings, worldviews that are developed with long histories of interactions with the natural society. And these are the types of knowledges that inform fundamental aspects of day-to-day life. So when we think about what Indigenous knowledge is,
being 3 o'clock,
if we could just ask all the participants to mute their microphones,
Okay.
that would be fantastic. Thank you. So they're actually, you know, according to the United Nations, and this was recorded in a document called the Cultural Survival Guide, there are actually 370 million Indigenous people around the world, belonging to over 5,000 groups, 90 countries all over the world, including Canada and the US, for example, where we are. And so it's really important to understand that this practice of Indigenous knowledge is going to be, the concept and practice is going to vary greatly from community to community. If we understand that Indigenous knowledges is about the interaction with the natural environment, and the natural environment in every community is different. So how certain values are understood and practiced here in Southern Ontario is going to be really different than how they're practiced in the far north, for instance, in the circumpolar region, because the environment is really different. So we have to bear that in mind when we're thinking about Indigenous knowledges. Oh, I have a duplicate slide there, sorry. So what I'd like to do to get us started, so this isn't too boring and you're not just listening to me the whole time, I would love for us all to break out into small breakout rooms of 3 people. Joshua, if you can put everyone in of 3 people, because that way everyone gets a chance to talk, where you share with each other what your own values are about knowledge and reality. You know, how do we come to knowledge? What does reality mean to us? And how do these fit with or challenge Indigenous knowledges in the research context? So we're going to spend about 7 minutes doing this, I think, in small groups. And then Clay and Josh and I will circulate to different groups to join you guys throughout the 7-ish minutes that we're doing this.
Just give me 1 sec. I just have to manually put everyone in groups.
I'm going to put the discussion questions in the chat.
I already did that, Suzanne.
Oh, wonderful. Big witch. So we'll circulate in the small group discussions. So what are your values and principles around knowledge and reality? And how do these fit or challenge Indigenous knowledges as you understand them as in the research context? So here we go. We've got the breakout rooms joined. I will randomly go to a breakout room and we'll call everybody back in about 7 to 10 minutes.
I'll set a timer.
Thank you. So, you know, one of the reasons that I thought it would be good for us to talk about understanding what our own values are around knowledges and how they fit or challenge what Indigenous knowledges are, because that might help us to better be able to understand and address the actual issues that exist in Indigenous knowledge translation in research. And these issues, there are many issues, but they've been clearly articulated by my colleagues at Well Living House. Dr. Smiley, Olding, and Ziegler have published an article that talk actually about Indigenous knowledge translation. So, you know, I'm referring to their work because they have done this work and they have written this article. And it's very important to understand that these issues are articulated from decades of doing this type of research and of working with Indigenous communities. So the main issues really in Indigenous knowledge translation in academics are related to cultural safety, health literacy, the protection of Indigenous knowledges, unmet community needs, publication biases in Western settings, the concept and practice of reciprocity in the research relationship, and the actual location of the research, of the project. So let's unpack these a little bit. So if you've ever come to a workshop with me or even taken a class with me at U of T, you'll know that I really center cultural safety in all healthcare practices, research, and education. And the reason that I do this is because in both the past and presently, Indigenous people experience high levels of racism and oppression in systemic settings. This creates what's been called a culturally unsafe place. Cultural safety was really first created in the late 90s by a Maori nurse who worked in the field and saw that Indigenous people in New Zealand and Australia were experiencing poor health outcomes because of what was happening in terms of the racism and oppression in all aspects of the healthcare setting. So she developed this this practice and model called cultural safety. And cultural safety is really what's taken, it's kind of known as the fourth wave of cross-cultural health in the world, and it's very cutting edge. So I think it's widely known and maybe not so widely accepted the researchers really have to engage in culturally safe practices in order to address the racism and the oppression that occurs systemically in research, healthcare, education. And really, when I say that, what does that mean? That means that everyone on the research team has to take cultural safety training, and that somebody, ideally the principal investigator, needs to be responsible in maintaining cultural safe practice throughout the research project. So I just put some examples of cultural safety training. Some of it's free, some of it you have to pay for, but you can get it for free. It's out there. So these are some of the examples, and I am going to put a handout of these slides in the chat at the end of the presentation. So you'll have all my slides in handouts at the end with these links. So just to give you, because maybe not everyone here knows what cultural safety is or why it's important. So I just have a really short video that I want to share with you about that. So let me see if I can get that going. Okay, it's coming. Give me 2 seconds. This is good. You're going to want to see this. Can everyone hear this?
Indigenous peoples thrived on the lands of present-day Canada for thousands of years. About 500 years ago, Europeans began to arrive. By the 1900s, an explicit colonial agenda to control and assimilate Indigenous peoples was in place. The impacts of this are still felt today and show up as a larger burden of ill health, loss of language and culture, dislocation, and marginalization. This history is part of Canada, and we all share a responsibility for healing relationships. How do we do this? Creating an environment of cultural safety in healthcare settings is one step toward healing this relationship. Cultural safety is achieved when people of diverse cultural and ethnic backgrounds feel respected and safe from discrimination. At Northern Health, our values include empathy, respect, collaboration, and innovation. When we put these values in action, we strive to honor diversity, genuinely care, and build trust through understanding. Cultural safety grows when these values are applied to the context of cultural differences. How can we do this? By developing our cultural awareness, sensitivity, and competency through cultural humility. Let's take a look at the meaning of each of these terms. Cultural humility is a lifelong journey of self-evaluation, reflection, and learning to deepen our understanding of how our life experiences influence how we understand and interact with others. The skills of self-reflection and assessment carry us along a path of understanding and change. The journey often starts with cultural awareness, recognizing that differences and similarities exist between cultures. Learning about the histories that impact Indigenous peoples in Canada is an important part of developing cultural awareness. Cultural sensitivity grows when we start to see the influences of our own culture and acknowledge that we have biases. This can be an eye-opening experience, and it may take courage and humility to walk this path. Cultural sensitivity is not about treating everyone the same. With cultural awareness and sensitivity comes a responsibility to act respectfully. Cultural competency is about developing practical skills for interacting in respectful ways with people who are different from us. It's about reducing the number of assumptions we make about people based on our biases. Cultural competency does not require us to become experts in cultures different from our own. Cultural safety improves as we proceed along this path of self-reflection and learning. The goal of culturally safe healthcare is that people feel respected and safe from discrimination when they access health services. As healthcare practitioners and service providers, we have an opportunity and a responsibility to provide the best quality care possible to all individuals. And this involves developing our cultural competence through humility. Along this journey, we begin to understand and appreciate the gifts that each of us brings to the table. Together, we can work to ensure that everyone is able to maintain their dignity when they are seeking care and at their most vulnerable. We can, as individuals and as organizations, foster trusting and respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people and communities. So our journey begins.
Hang on. Back to the presentation. So while that presentation was geared towards healthcare workers, it can also be applied to research, and it must be applied to research in order to mitigate the harms that occur through unsafe practices. And I'm sure that everyone here has multiple experiences with racism and oppression in the healthcare system, whether you're Indigenous or not, because Indigenous people are not the only people who experience these in the healthcare system. But we do know that the racism and access are the #1 challenges to Indigenous health in Canada, for instance, not technical or biological issues or processes. So this is very powerful and very important to deal with when we're talking about any procedure within a program of research, including knowledge translation. Another issue in knowledge translation is around health literacy. So there are actually Indigenous specific models of literacy that exist and should be used. So for example, there's one called the Rainbow Holistic Approach to Aboriginal Literacy, which uses 7 ways of knowing based on the 7 directions that corresponds to colors and is used in a holistic framework that's about balancing, and you can access that there. The issue of health literacy is about understanding that researchers need to use Indigenous conceptions of both literacy in terms of the actual knowledge translation products, which are often written, and health literacy. So consider literacy from traditional ecological knowledge frameworks and Indigenous knowledge frameworks. So I'll give you an example of how in one project that we did that we used Indigenous conceptions of literacy and health literacy. We did a project on homelessness, Indigenous mental health and homelessness with our community partner. And the young people who were involved in the research as participants asked us if we would create a graphic novel with the results. So it took a long time, months and months, like probably 6 or 8 months, but we created a graphic novel, which I will find a link to that somewhere and get it put into the chat for you guys. Or I can put my email in the chat and you can email me and I will mail you a copy of the graphic novel if you're interested in, because they're all printed so that the community youth wanted them printed so they could go out into the community. So that's an example of how we used an Indigenous concept of literacy with the population we were working with. And that's, you know, how you can strategize with your community partners and the knowledge users. That's a really Western term, but meaning the actual people in the community who are going to benefit from your research results, to ensure that research results are written in a way that people understand. And this includes very basic ideas, like working with our community partners to co-create non-academic language summaries of the research. In Western research, they call these community newsletters. You know, and I think the most important thing is to ask your community partners how and where information should be shared. How do we create these products of the research that are going to make it to the people who need to understand what these results are so that people can benefit from them? Another big issue in Indigenous KT is this protection of Indigenous knowledges, and this comes up time and time again throughout the research process. And that's because colonization, the destruction, and cultural appropriation of Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and that this continues today in academic settings. So for example, things like appropriation of Indigenous plant knowledge in the development of medicine without consent, acknowledgement, or benefit to Indigenous people. More florid, horrific examples exist, like nutrition experiments that were done on children in residential schools. There are many examples that all of us could think of, but there's clear reasons why Indigenous knowledges need to be protected throughout research and in the KT process. Because currently there are actually no laws that protect Indigenous knowledges in research or elsewhere for that matter. And what this is really about is concepts and practices of, you know, ownership, control, access, and possession of Indigenous data. So what does this mean? This means that researchers and their entire teams, in my opinion, must take OCAP training. OCAP is a training that was created in Canada to address issues of ownership, control, access, and possession of Indigenous data, ethical issues. And OCAP guidelines need to be followed in data use and sharing. And there's a link here to the OCAP training, and there's a link there also to the documents of the OCAP principles and how to use them in research in order to mitigate harms to Indigenous people through the use of Indigenous data. So it's really about sovereignty and data sovereignty and data management. Unmet community needs are another issue. And that's because colonization and unequal distribution of health and economic resources has led Indigenous peoples to be overburdened with things like poverty, chronic disease and illness, housing inequity, employment challenges, and more. So it's critical for researchers to see that these unmet needs and high disease burdens actually can interfere with participation in all aspects of research and health information sharing events and programs. And it's up to us as researchers to figure out how that whatever the results of our research are, even if they're not in any of these specific areas, can be used to address these unmet needs, and how that we can ensure that research results are reaching people who are dealing with these unmet needs. So I think this is a wonderful thing that Smiley and her colleagues articulated in their article. The publication bias. So here again, we're back to this issue of competing definitions of knowledge and what is and isn't knowledge in the academic setting. And that leads to the situation of most existing research results are published without the use of Indigenous knowledges, meaning there's a lack of Indigenous-led and authored publications. There's a lack of community-determined and co-created resources within all Indigenous research. You know, there's a very small sliver of Indigenous research that is led by Indigenous researchers compared to the body of Indigenous research that exists in Canada, on Turtle Island, or in the world. And the fact is that Indigenous-led results are often not considered as acceptable by top-tier academic journals because they use Indigenous knowledges in the research methods, procedures, and processes. Another really big issue is this issue of reciprocity in knowledge translation. And, you know, reciprocity is, so I did a whole workshop on reciprocity in Indigenous research several months ago. I think it was in March, and that's on our website. And I mean, on our YouTube channel, my apologies. And so when we talk about reciprocity, you know, we're talking about this understanding that there's an interconnectedness that's based in Indigenous knowledges. And, you know, in research, when we talk about reciprocity, we're really talking about research benefiting all people involved. Even though that's kind of a little far away from how it's understood and applied in Indigenous knowledges and principles, it's that same understanding of respect and responsibility. So reciprocity it's this major value in all Indigenous cultures. How it's practiced is different in every community because every community is in a different space with different ways of living and practicing that value of reciprocity. That lack of reciprocity in research is a common way that ethical violations are made by researchers who are doing research with Indigenous peoples, with Indigenous communities, or on Indigenous lands. We really need to ensure that this is something that's addressed, and that communities, peoples, and lands and individuals participating in the research actually benefit from the academic research. How can we do this? It's really simple. Ask the people, ask the community partners, ask the Indigenous leaders in the area, have that relationship. Step away from that Western hierarchical position as the expert in research. One more of the important issues in Indigenous knowledges is about location, as articulated by Smiley and colleagues. And, you know, Indigenous people live in diverse locations across every country. So here in Canada, for instance, we have Indigenous people in rural areas, on First Nations reserves that may be near towns or cities, or maybe in very remote areas that are very hard to access. Many Indigenous people in Canada, for instance, live in urban areas. What's really important is that researchers must collaborate with Indigenous community partners to actively reflect on what is unique about the context and location where a knowledge translation activity is to take place, and that specific strategies need to be made based on what that context is to take into account the challenges or the strengths in that community. So for example, with a lot of the research that I do and have done in partnership with organizations that service the homeless or people who are experiencing risks of homelessness or street involvement, is that we actually go out, you know, into parks and into with the mobile team where people are, and that's where we may do data collection, or we may share results. We go to where the people are at, and I think that's really important to do that rather than hold dissemination activities only in the university, for example. So to kind of bring this back to like, what does this look like in process? This is really about engaging community partners in the knowledge translation process. That means inviting community partners, staff, and their service users at the direction of the community partners leaders to be part of the research process, and the research team like actively working within the research project, and training those community partner members in knowledge translation along with the rest of the student or academic research team, and ensuring that you pay community member research team members at the same rate as you would pay graduate students. It's also about ensuring that elders and traditional knowledge keepers are actively involved in the research team data and KT processes, and to meet frequently and in-depthly with leadership of community partners throughout an entire project, including, you know, KT production creation, to make sure that you're checking in and getting feedback from them on every step. And that meeting as often as possible is also about ensuring that ongoing informed consent is happening. That's a key ethical issue in all aspects of research, and that needs to be paid to attention in the knowledge translation step of research. And, you know, just to kind of circle back to this question about ethics, you know, ethics are at the forefront of all Indigenous research and in every procedural step. You know, that informed consent, we have to remember to keep going back and asking, is this okay? Is this, you know, is this what you want? That reciprocity, benefiting, offering tobacco, providing honorariums, that's what that looks like in concrete terms. Respect, that means when we're interacting with our community partners and our community members, we're using empathic listening and speaking skills all the time. Means using a trauma-informed cultural safety framework for the research, both conceptually and behaviorally in our actions with participants and community partners and colleagues throughout the project. So before we get into discussion, I just want to invite Clayton to say anything, to make any comments or add anything that I may have missed from an actual Indigenous knowledges perspective and not from the academic Indigenous knowledges perspective from which I come from. So Clay, are you there? I do this to you every time, Clay, so I'm sure that, let me stop sharing for a second. Clayton? Might take him a minute to unmute.
Sorry, I'm here. Oh. Yeah, I was thinking about I'm really kind of, see, I'll just explain myself, and you know, as a traditional practitioner, you know, I'm not a researcher. I am not an academic. I am not any of those things. And I really started thinking about all of those things. I wanted to be one, and I'm interested in those things. And then I realized, no, I don't really want to be one. I had no interest. But I'll just say this about Indigenous research. And if there's no exchange, mutual exchange, right, then it's not Indigenous. I'll just put it that way, very simply put. Because in my own journey, learning about my traditional values and traditional ways of knowing and being, and I was very privileged, and one of the very privileged as a young person, my parents handed it to me, taught me it, but then they said, go out and explore and see other things, talk to other communities and everything. And so I traveled a lot as a young person and sat with many spiritual people. And one of them was, so I was a researcher. I was researching my own identity at the same time, trying to figure out who I am. And so I'd just say this, and I say this a lot, and we seem to be stuck as human beings in the dimension of human, not understanding the dimension of being anymore. And this is where I was interested in the dimension of being. We're the human beings, right? What I mean by that is all things of the earth have being, but we're the human beings, and everybody seems to be, we seem to be there in that idea of human, but not understanding that. So our traditional values have always had that connection to being, to the sun, sky, universe, all things of the earth have being. So when Dr. Suzanne asked me to come on board, and I was kind of thinking about, well, and then we started talking, and I remember this conversation. And so I got very excited about, because in my own way, I was traveling, talking to spiritual people and everything. And they had this connection to that sky world, we'll say, and through ceremony, all of this. And this is what I get excited about, is having conversations with those people, but you have to participate in ceremony, right? So you're in the sweat lodge, you're fasting, you're doing all these things, you're in the community in those ceremonies, doing what they're doing. So if I went to the Lakotas, I am Lakota. If I went to the whoever tribe, I am there. I'm with them. And so I started to look at it differently and see and realize they have this, our traditional people, the knowledge holders, our elders, our ceremonial, our healers, they have this connection to the sky world. And this is where I got excited. And it was just like having those conversations with them, like our ancestors did, right? And there's very few of them who actually can do that now, because a lot of it's just based on faith, right? And just in believing. And so all of this, and finding that, finding that connection. So when I started to look at that, I was like, wow, this is an opportunity for us to go out, talk with them, participate in ceremony, invite them, all of this, because it's all spirit led, right? We are spirit experiencing something, as being the people, the human beings. And so I really got, and I was like, let's do that. And then just say, let's have these conversations with them, and maybe they can give us some guidance in how to heal ourselves and make this a better place. And so when I started thinking like that and so that's where me and Dr. Suzanne were like, yes, let's do that. And you guys are doing all your research, and that's great on the, in a Western kind of research lens. But again, if it's the only thing I could really say to you all is, if you're approaching the communities, it's an exchange. So that's Indigenous research, right? Where you're involved with the community as a human being, you're participating, you're with them, you're asking them what they want to research, because we're all in the journey of healing the self, and we're all at different levels, and we're all trying to decolonize ourselves. And it begins with our minds, right? The gift that I'm told, and I really see this now as I get older, is the gift of life, but also the gift of our intelligence, right? Thinking about these things, right? Allowing that energy of thought to flow. And I noticed something with them when I sat with them and I sit with them. I noticed something about this. They have this ability because they've connected this to this, right? Their minds and their hearts, they're thinking, they're feeling, they're recognizing the reality that they're in. They see it for what it is and the beauty it is. All of this life, etc. And it's very humbling to be amongst them. And recently, when I was in Saskatoon, I met a man, and I haven't, and my mother knew him way back in the day in the 70s. And there was the proof, because this man was such a humble man. And when he walked in the room, he had such a presence. He was connected to spirit. He was connected. And I was just, and I remember when I was talking to him, I was telling him my story and everything, and ceremonies, and my parents were part of those ceremonies that he was part of, and I was not privileged to be there because I was just a baby. I was just a kid, but it brought tears to my eyes. Again, just having that conversation with him about there are still people out there, right? There are still healers. There are still people who are connected to that sky world. And this is what I mean by having that conversation to, in a humble way, in a good way, to ask our ancestors, what is it we need to do, right, to make this world better? What is it we need to do to heal the self? What is it we need to do? All of this. So research, to me, that's how I look at it. It was beautiful. And my only advice to you, if you want it, is if you're going to come and sit with us, there's an exchange. There has to be that exchange, right? You have to be with them and sit with us and participate, and you become one of us. You become, and it's always about identifying as a human being. Because I know in this world, in academia, everybody has to have a title, right? They like titles. They gave me a title. They say elder. I'm not an elder. I'm just old, right? I'm just elderly. That's just, so I walk with humbleness. And it's challenging on our part. I'll just say another part of us as spiritual practitioners, it's very challenging us. It's very challenging to me to get and talk about this, because we're supposed to be humble people, right? We're supposed to walk with humility, humble people. But on the other hand, we're the most beautiful people at the same time, right? And to express that beauty through our indigenous ways of knowing and being, I'll say, through our ceremonies, all of this. And that's all basically that our ceremonies are doing for us, is reminding us of who we are, the people, the human beings, bone, flesh, and blood, liquids, minerals of the earth, human. The being comes from your relationship to the sun, sky, universe. All things of the earth have being, right? And this is what our ceremonies, this is what they remind me of. So it's very humbling, right? It's very beautiful, and all of this. And we're all in this process of finding that again. Because as Dr. Suzanne said, and in that video explained what we have experienced, right? And so decolonizing the mind, it begins with that. So if you're going to sit with us, you sit with us, right? You sit with us. You share their mutual exchange, right, of who we are and you are. And they'll ask you what they want, right, for you to research, to help their communities. Totally different. I know it's challenging, isn't it? Because you've all been trained a certain way, but that's so the way I see this, and many of us see this is a complete game changer when it comes to research, right? That Western lens of research, completely different, very, very, it has its place, but so do we. So with that, I just say, miigwech, and that's all I got. So, miigwech.
Amazing. And I just take issue with one thing, with saying you're elderly, because we're the same age.
Well, you look younger than me. So.
Elderly, that there is. So just to be clear about that. So thank you, Clay. And that's really wonderful, because what's so important is to ensure that we are doing things from an Indigenous knowledges framework and procedures, meaning that we actually have our elders doing, knowledge keepers and elders doing the work with us. We don't just bring them in to do an opening and closing and then never talk to them or ask them to be actively part of what we're doing. And that's so important to avoid tokenism, which is just another form of cultural appropriation. So that meaningful engagement with our knowledge keepers throughout the KT or research process is really important. So I'm going to turn it back to you guys to have a discussion, maybe 7 to 10 minutes. Joshua can put us into groups of 3 about how can you use the Indigenous KT model and strategies that I've shared with you in this workshop, and what Clay talked about as well. And what are your reflections on what we've shared in this workshop today? So we're gonna, have 7 to 10 minutes depending on what our time frame is. I think we have 10 minutes actually. I think, Josh, if you want to put us all into the groups for 10 minutes,
Yep.
and I will put, or someone will put those, I can put those questions in the chat right now.
Okay. I just added them too, Suzanne. Oh, so did you.
Double add. So we'll all go to break rooms and we'll circulate among them as well. And please, this is a really important part of the workshop where we can actually integrate what's been shared. Miigwech. 10 minutes should be good.
All right.
Because we have time, so we're not running out of time as usual on these things.
All right. Everyone's been assigned.
I just have to run and get some water before I go to a group.
Hi, I was just in a room by myself.
Oh, okay. I'll add you to a different one, Stephanie.
Okay, thank you.
No worries.
Stephanie, are you Isidore's daughter?
No, I'm Sunny's daughter, who you did teach, but it was years ago in the ICCP at UVic.
At UVic? Oh my God, that was like 20 years ago.
Well, you taught her in the Indigenous Communities Counseling. So I think that was like, yeah.
I used to go back there in the summer, actually, after I moved to UT. Sunny. Was that a guy?
No, so that's my mom, Sunny Marsh. She would have been in her mid-50s, probably.
I remember Marsh. I remember Sunny Marsh very vaguely. But
yeah, it was a while ago, but someone who's like a sister to me is Allison Reeves. We live just right beside each other, basically in Toronto right now. Yeah, so
that's amazing.
Yeah, so she shared, that she knows you, and yeah, so I'm in Toronto now, and was excited to come today and hear from you because I know of you, but I've never gotten to actually learn from you directly.
Well, my email's in the chat, so send me an email and we can get together for coffee or something.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'd love that. I'm just in my first year, so I'm with Jeff in the CCP program at U of T. So,
well, email me and we'll get together. I'd really like that.
Okay, I would love that. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Josh. I'm interrupting the workshop to chat.
Oh yeah. Okay, I'll go to this group.
I have to go get a glass of water and join my group too. Thank you.
Did I put you in a new group, Stephanie? Oh yeah, I guess I did. She's gone.
There's one person left there.
Yeah, this person's been kind of coming in and out of the in and out of the session the whole time. So maybe they
might have stepped away from the computer.
Activity issues or something.
What happened?
Sorry, there's no one there either.
Oh, that's weird. Okay, yeah. I mean, everyone like some people cleared out.
Okay.
The last one. So hold on. Let me just enter. Oh shit. Sorry. Okay, give me 1 second. I
put her in Billy Joe's group. Billy Joe's there for sure.
Okay. Move to. I don't know where Billy Joe is. What group is she in? I don't even see her on the list of things. Okay, I'm gonna move you to room 4.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm gonna go get a glass of water. I'll be right back.